was a usual night at home, but for some reason I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, and no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't seem to find rest. I tossed and turned in bed for what felt like hours, and eventually the frustration grew too much. Unable to take it anymore, I decided to get up and go to the kitchen. Drawing always helped me relax, so I figured I'd sit at the table and sketch for a while until I could finally fall asleep. I grabbed my sketchbook and a pencil, settling into the chair at the kitchen table. The house was eerily quiet at this hour, with only the hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. It was comforting in a way. I opened the sketchbook to a blank page and began to draw, losing myself in the lines and shapes as I always did. It was the one thing that calmed my restless mind. As I was drawing, my phone buzzed. It was my cousin, and we started chatting about drawings, comics, and all sorts of random topics. His messages kept me distracted, and I felt a sense of ease wash over me as I shared my ideas with him. The conversation was light and fun, and for a moment I forgot about the unease I had been feeling earlier. The quiet of the night, combined with the simple act of drawing, made everything feel almost normal again. I kept sketching, sending my cousin updates of my progress. It felt like a peaceful, uneventful night, one where nothing could possibly go wrong. Little did I know that sense of calm would soon be shattered. After a few minutes of drawing, I started to feel something unusual. It was subtle at first, just a faint sense that something was off. I noticed it out of the corner of my left eye, a shadow, or perhaps a figure, standing in the corridor just outside the kitchen. My first thought was that it was my wife, maybe getting up to grab a glass of water or something. But there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. A chill ran down my spine, and a feeling of unease began to creep over me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. My heart began to race as I continued to draw, unable to fully focus on my work anymore. The figure in the hallway didn't move. It just stood there silently. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at it, as if somehow doing so would make the feeling worse. I could feel the presence, though, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The air in the kitchen grew heavier, thick with an oppressive tension that seemed to hang in the room. My stomach tightened, and I couldn't shake the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The silence of the night no longer felt comforting. It felt suffocating, as though the world around me was holding its breath. I tried to focus on my drawing, but every time I glanced toward the corridor, I could feel that presence still there, watching, waiting. I was paralyzed with discomfort, caught between the urge to look and the fear of what might happen if I did. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something wasn't right, and that feeling only grew stronger with each passing second. Without warning, I saw something move quickly from the corner of my eye, something dark, like a shadow darting toward the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and a surge of panic gripped me. It was so sudden, so sharp, that I immediately jumped up from my chair, my breath catching in my throat. I turned toward the kitchen doorway, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I stood frozen for a moment, straining to see anything in the dimly lit corridor, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. My pulse raced as I scanned every corner, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The overwhelming sense of dread, though, remained thick and suffocating in the air. It felt as though something was still there, lingering just beyond my reach, watching me from the shadows. I could feel a coldness in the room, an icy chill that made my skin crawl. My body was tense, every muscle locked in fear. Despite the emptiness in the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was close, like an invisible force pressing against me. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, it was the certainty that whatever it wasn't good. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't move. My eyes darted around the room, but all I could see was the familiar kitchen, now bathed in an unnatural stillness. It was as if the world had gone silent, and all that was left was this dark, oppressive presence that seemed to seep into the very air I was breathing. And for a moment I wondered if it would ever leave. My heart was pounding in my chest, every beat louder than the last as the fear consumed me. I couldn't stand being in that room any longer, the oppressive atmosphere choking the air from my lungs. Without thinking, I rushed down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. I flung the bedroom door open and shook my wife awake, my voice trembling as I told her what had just happened. I must have sounded frantic, but the terror I felt was real. She sat up immediately, her eyes wide with concern, as I explained everything, the strange feeling, the shadow, the coldness. As I spoke, I could see the fear slowly creeping into her own expression. She didn't say anything at first, but I could tell that she felt it too, the unease that had settled over the house. It wasn't just in my mind. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right here. After a few moments, we decided to pray together. We needed to do something, anything, to rid the house of whatever presence had taken hold. We sat side by side, hands clasped, and began to pray, our voices trembling with both fear and hope. The tension in the room thickened, the air almost suffocating as we recited the words, trying to purify the space. With each prayer, I felt the presence linger, like an invisible force pressing against us, refusing to leave. As we continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It wasn't some trick of the mind or the house playing games. What had happened in the kitchen, the coldness in the air, the shadow, I knew, deep down, that it was something truly evil. And I wasn't sure if our prayers would be enough to drive it away. After we finished praying, the atmosphere in the house did seem to calm down. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air lifted slightly, and for a moment I thought maybe it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The events of that night, the shadow, the coldness, the overwhelming feeling of being watched, they lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. I kept asking myself, was it something paranormal, or had my mind just played tricks on me? Perhaps I was simply overtired, letting my imagination run wild in the dead of night. But no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. There was something dark in that house, something that wasn't quite right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching us. As the days passed, I tried to move on, but the fear never fully left. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, made my skin crawl. I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house alone at night anymore. Whenever I did, I'd feel it, the same unsettling presence, the same watchful feeling that I wasn't alone, even if no one else was there. It's been months now, and though life has returned to normal in many ways, the terror of that night still haunts me. I'll never be able to fully explain what happened. I don't know if it was a ghost, an evil spirit, or something else entirely. All I know is that something dark visited us that night, and a part of me feels like it's still waiting in the shadows. It was a typical end-of-year night, and my coworker and I were finishing up our shift at the clothing store. The hours had dragged on, but everything seemed to be going smoothly. The store, located in an old building with 4 floors, was quiet now, and the last customers had long since left. We were just about ready to close everything up and head home. We locked the doors and double-checked everything, making sure all the lights were off. It was a bit strange being the last ones there, with the entire building silent around us. My coworker decided to wait outside in the front while I went to the back parking lot to grab the car. It wasn't uncommon for us to be the last to leave, but tonight the stillness of the building felt heavier than usual. As I walked to the back of the building, I couldn't help but notice how deserted it felt. The parking lot was dimly lit, and the long hallway to the storage room seemed even more desolate in the late hours. It was just the 2 of us in the whole building now, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being alone in a place that had seen much more life earlier in the day. The atmosphere felt normal at first, but as I started my car and glanced back toward the store, a sense of isolation began to creep in. Being the last ones there, in such an empty place, made everything feel off, like something was just waiting to happen. It was the kind of night where every creak and distant sound made you second-guess everything. I made my way to the parking lot at the back of the building, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallways. My coworker was waiting for me out front, but something in the air felt strange, like I was the only one left in the world. As I passed by the storage room window, I caught a glimpse of someone inside. At first, I thought it was my coworker. She looked exactly like her, standing in the dim light of the stockroom, moving around as if she was looking for something. I assumed she had forgotten something and had come back inside to grab it. After all, it wasn't out of the ordinary for someone to run back in after they thought they had everything. Still, the sight of meeting her made me pause for a moment. The way she was moving in the dark room didn't sit right with me, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't about to overthink it. She was probably just picking up a forgotten item or something small. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and shifted it into gear. While I was adjusting, I glanced back toward the window again, expecting to see her still in there. But the lights inside had suddenly gone out. The room was now dark. A strange feeling washed over me, like the moment had shifted into something else entirely. I couldn't help but feel uneasy, but I pushed the thought aside. I drove around to the front of the building, thinking she must have been waiting for me. It didn't make sense to keep wondering about it. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. But deep down, a small voice kept nagging at me, urging me to think harder about what I had just seen. As I turned the car around, I glanced back toward the building once more. I couldn't shake the image of the woman in the stockroom from my mind. But then, as I looked, I noticed something odd. The lights in the stockroom were now off. The room that had just moments ago been dimly lit was completely dark. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing, just the lights turning off after some time, maybe on a timer or something. I drove toward the front of the building, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me. I figured she had probably left, and maybe that was why I hadn't seen her when I looked back. I parked and walked toward the front entrance. As I stepped through the door, there she was, standing and waiting, just as she had been when I left. My confusion deepened. I walked up to her, a question already forming on my lips. "Did you go back to the stockroom?" I asked, trying to mask the unease I felt. She looked at me, her expression puzzled, like she hadn't heard me right. "No," she replied slowly. "I left with you. I never went back inside. I'm just here, waiting for you like I said." I felt my stomach tighten. There was no way she hadn't been in the stockroom. I had seen her, or at least someone who looked exactly like her, but she swore she never went back. We stared at each other for a moment, neither of us sure what to make of the situation. Something wasn't adding up, and the fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind now felt all too real. We both stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, but the answers seemed impossible to find. I kept replaying the events in my head. I had clearly seen someone in the stockroom, someone who looked exactly like my coworker, yet she was standing right in front of me, insisting she hadn't gone back inside. I tried to brush it off, but the weight of the situation was too heavy. I attempted to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had seen things. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like something far beyond explanation was at play. The air around us grew thick, charged with an unsettling energy, and I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that something unnatural was happening. Then, in the silence, we both remembered we had both heard the stories, the rumors that had floated around the building ever since we started working there. Some of the older employees had mentioned strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, shadows in the hallways, and the feeling of being watched. I had thought they were just old stories to scare the new hires, but now, with the chilling tension between us, those stories felt too real to ignore. We exchanged a glance, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She was thinking the same thing I was. The building might actually be haunted. The thought made the air feel even heavier, like we weren't alone anymore. It was as if whatever had been lurking in the darkness was now fully aware of us. We were no longer just employees finishing a late shift. We were intruders in a place that didn't want us there. We didn't say a word as we rushed out of the building, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The fear was overwhelming, and every shadow seemed to hide something watching us. Neither of us dared to look back as we quickly made our way to the front door. When we finally stepped outside, it felt like we were escaping something that had been waiting for us in the dark corners of that old building. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I don't know if it was a trick of the mind, a figment of our tired imaginations, or if something truly supernatural was at play. I've tried to rationalize it, but the feeling of dread that lingered in that stockroom, the way my coworker's face looked when she said she hadn't been inside, still haunts me. I still wonder if the building is really haunted or if we were just victims of our own fear. Even years later, the memory of that night remains with me. The sensation of being watched, the confusion of seeing someone who wasn't there, and the chilling stories we had heard about the place, it all blends together in a way I can't shake. Every time I pass that building now, I feel that same uneasy weight on my chest, and I can't help but wonder if there's something still lingering inside, waiting for the next curious soul to walk in. The truth is, I'll never know for sure what happened that night, but the fear of the unknown, the fear of what we saw or thought we saw still lingers in the back of my mind, and I don't think it will ever let me go.